Interlude Kushkotlan. When he was but a young pup, freshly pulled from rural schooling for academy life in the provincial capital, Coyote had laid his eyes on the city of Kushkotlan for the first time. It might be sacrilege to even think such things, but Coyote had from that day onward held it to be the most beautiful of Sholoshaidi's creations, above and beyond even the Empire's thrumming heart in Tepeklan. Its soaring, terraced stone streets seemed content to take their sweet architectural time, meandering up the sheer cliffs of the Kushkot Mountains, all while an envious sun baked the red rock with the intoxicating, dry heat so dear to Sholoshaitian hearts. After darkness, when the moon glittered from the obsidian shingles of the old quarters during the nocturnal hours belonging to Harakwe, it seemed all the more alive. Newfangled automotives and flickering streetlights danced through the stained glass of residential windows to play upon residents as they slept or laughed, loved or cried. It was rare for a son of the country, like Coyote, to willingly forsake the sprawling wilderland plantations and ranches of the backroads for the city once their mandatory service was spent, in the wake of graduation from the Kalmakak Academy. Especially here, where the famed eagle cast of pre-unification Kushkotlan's kingdom had been fashioned into the rangers and mountaineer infantry of the Empire, officers tended to opt for backcountry recruitment and instruction positions rather than lobby for command of garrisons and police forces in the provincial capital. For Coyote, though, this had become home, in spite of his lingering love of the more remote peaks of the Kushkot Range. He might not have been born within the city's ancient walls, still marked by the sieges and shots of legions both foreign and domestic, but he had known it to be his place since riding by horse-drawn cart into the noonday shadow of brooding old Kushkotlan on that initial day, decades ago. Yesterday's telegram from the outpost town of Shonala, about a day's travel by auto or train and a couple more by foot towards the northeastern border, had worried others little. After all, it was a report of an Ida incursion, and among a people as fond of pillage as the northern barbarians, tiny bands of wayward wanderers were not entirely uncommon. Every few years, 10 or 20 of the reptilian giants would climb the sheerest of the mountains forming the border between Sholoshaiti and the untamed Ida lands, avoiding the guarded passes shored firm against their advance. They would burn a farm or plantation, mangle and ravage its inhabitants, and devour its livestock before being rounded up and slaughtered by local militias, reminded by force that in this age of powder and thundering guns, Sholoshaiti was the master of the field. Most had shrugged off the news, the ancient foe in the north being waved away with the surety of artillery and automatic weapons to back the sentiment up. Cohort Commander Coyote, however, had not been so sure. Trite as it seemed to think of it in that way, he had a bad feeling about the message. He had been the first of the officers among the city's royal garrison of Ektal to suggest a muster of extra troops, a suggestion which had been firmly, if politely, ignored. So deep ran his dread that he circumnavigated the traditional command structure and ordered several squads of lightly armed Ektal rangers out of the city by unmarked car, silently ensuring there would be forward warning if enemies crested the hills north of Kushkotlan. It was just his luck that his sleight of hand was discovered almost immediately, and he had been ordered to report to the palace to await reprimand at the hands of his overseeing legate in a huff of bureaucratic irritation. Then they had lost contact with Shonala, along with 3 other small, garrisoned towns along the border, receiving not so much as a distress code before the telegraph offices had gone dark. Now, Coyote's act of defiance was being hailed as preemptive, and it was mimicked by many others in his position across the city before, finally, the regent marshal manning the throne in the absence of the queen issued a call for the 3 reserve legions of the Imperial Army stationed across Kushkotlan province to be placed on standby, and for any Ektal Rangers who had survived whatever happened at the border to make their way south to harass the enemy. They now stood ready to reinforce the Ektal Legion already stationed in the provincial capital. Coyote, for his part, was too worried to feel vindicated. He had stayed up through the night, his eyes glued to the jagged horizon across the rocky lowlands that swept north away from Kushkotlan for some miles before climbing up again into the clouds. Just before dawn, a glow had risen in the northern sky like a newborn sun racing to supplant the old, and Coyote was unsurprised to learn that sporadic fighting had been reported, with the suburb of Moshtlan having been lost. The exact numbers of the enemy were in question, but whichever reports one believed, the takeaway was the same. Whatever was happening in Kushkotlan province, it was something which had not been witnessed in nearly half a millennium. It was something which should have been a relic of past ages. "Cohort Commander Coyote," came breathless words from beside him, the snap of booted feet being brought to attention drawing his gaze. Coyote turned to see the limestone-gray face of Centurion Oshkoat, flush with color, eyes wide. The younger officer had sprinted the stairs to the towers from which the cohort commander kept his watch. The militia cohort's old veterans stitched together in the indefensible cities further north are being told to withdraw, either to Kushkotlan or to the south of the province, to join up with legions of the Imperial Army when they move north to reinforce the city. The call has gone out to Tepeklan. A state of war should be declared soon. "The Council of Harakwe will be convening about now," Coyote remarked. "I pray they move quickly." In the distance, as if in retort to his prayers, a plume of fire being put to some newly captured building, invisible behind the far spires of the mountains, billowed high enough to make the distant glow swell white for a moment. "You were the first to acknowledge the Ida threat, and so the Legate and Regent Marshal have handed the honor of addressing the Ektal in the city down to you," reported Oshkoat. "I've rallied all 19 of the Ektal cohorts in Kushkotlan for your address, sir. They stand ready in the lower district." "Give me a moment, Centurion," said Coyote. "I wish to see what we're facing before I speak to the men. I need to know whether or not I'm giving a eulogy." Oshkoat seemed flustered, but gave the imperial salute and fell quiet. His eyes joined Coyote's on the far passes through the northern ranges, which blocked their view. They did not have to wait long. As the dawn crept in to aid the burning towns in the distance, it cast light on scattered mobs of staggering civilians making their way through the valley. They fled for the safety of the mountain fortress of Kushkotlan, just as their forebears had done in centuries long dead, bearing elderly relatives and household heirlooms in carts and cars stacked high with the produce of lives fruitfully lived. Many of their sons and husbands would already be dead, Coyote wagered, sacrificed to slow whatever reptilian horde lurked north of the mountains, the first line of Sholoshaidi's defense valiantly spent. How could this happen? Oshkoat had asked the question in a manner that made it seem almost accidental. It was as if the minutes spent drinking in the suffering below had drug it forcefully up out of his gut. "Something was done to the warning systems on the border," Coyote said. "This is no normal Ida incursion. We would have known. Kushkotlan would have had days to prepare." He fell silent for long minutes as the first of the distant enemy flowed through the passes like a roiling tide of oil, dirtied by soot, blood, and the long march's grime. Their horrible bulk could not be appreciated from miles away, nor could the awful stench of carrion-eating predators that stalked their thunderous footfalls. From here, they seemed as ants in aimless formation, given a direction and unleashed to run slipshod for the finish line. Thousands upon thousands called up from their dolmen dens to feed. "The Ida don't have the cunning for this," Coyote muttered. "For all their faults, their honor codes are unbreakable. They are a blunt instrument. They would never learn the systems of warm bloods to knock out the telegraph lines or compromise the border stations. Ida are strong, bold, crude. Oshkoat was silent, watching in horror as a group of Sholoshaitians who had holed up in a small stone farmhouse upon seeing they would be overtaken were dragged out and either consumed or defiled by the roaring wave of scale and sinew. Their ends were abstract pinpoints and faint gunshots at this distance, but imagination filled in the gaps left there by intervening miles. "They were helped," said Coyote. "Someone compromised the gates for them." They could hear the gravel-rough chanting of alien reptilian vocal cords on the fire-haunted winds now. "Someone will answer for this," said Coyote. "When this is all over, whether Kushkotlan stands or burns, the Empire will sniff it out. Annihilation will find them."